important fuel properties. So they're solubility and phase behavior, consistency in production, environmental impacts, safety, storage stability, viscosity. All right, so solubility and phase behavior. A really important thing to realize about alternative fuels is that it's very likely that they're going to be diluted into petroleum fuels to start with. And if you start adding a lot of the alternative fuel into your petroleum fuel stream, you can exceed the solubility limit. And that can cause a lot of trouble. You can make an emulsion, you can have different kinds of phase separations, and that can clog the fuel filter, clog the fuel injection system. And so that's a really serious performance problem. And so you have to really know the phase diagram of your proposed new fuel component with gasoline or with diesel or with jet fuel, whichever you're going to try to dissolve it into. Also, in practice, all the fuels are often exposed to water. There's leaks in the tanks, there's leaks in the pipelines, so there's water present. And the current fuels are designed to be very hydrophobic, so they don't really dissolve into the water. If you have a fuel component that does dissolve into the water, when the water comes into contact with the fuel, what happens is that component will migrate over into the water phase. And then, for example, suppose you have a gasoline tank. So you have a gasoline tank under the ground. It's a gas station. And you have your gasoline in here. If you have a little leak here, and there's a groundwater flowing by, there's water flowing by, the gasoline, if it has components that are soluble in water, those will tend to migrate into the water, and they'll be carried away. Suppose I have some molecule X, and it's soluble in water. After a while, this water is going to have some X in it. And if this goes down to somebody's well, and then they drink it, then you better hope that X is not toxic, or you have a really big problem. And so knowing whether or not your component you're adding to the gasoline is soluble in water, whether or not it's biodegradable, whether or not it's toxic, those are like crucial things you need to know. Also, a more subtle thing is that if you get water into a tank, sometimes you have weird phase behavior, so that you have some polar components dissolved enough in the gasoline that it's okay, but when you add water, it might form a two-phase or even a three-phase system. And so that can be surprising to you, that you thought that you were safe, but because you add a little bit of water, you may actually induce a phase separation. And that's a problem in like pipelines. So right now, ethanol is shipped separately from gasoline. It has to be mixed up with the gasoline very close to the gas station, because they found out when they put the ethanol in the gasoline ahead of time and shipped it through pipelines, there's little bit of puddles of water on the bottoms of pipelines. When the ethanol gasoline mixture got in contact with that water, that phase actually expanded. A lot of the ethanol went into the water phase, and then you get big blobs of water ethanol. And then the gasoline went through, is being stripped of the ethanol, and so it didn't have the right amount of ethanol in it. And then every once in a while, a big slug of this water ethanol mixture would come out, and then that person who filled their car up with the water ethanol might be really annoyed because their car wouldn't work. So this is a problem. All right. And there's similar kinds of problems with solubility if you have some different vision. So if you don't envision that your new fuel is going to be mixed in with the petroleum fuel but being kept separately, you still have to worry about what it's going to do with water, because your tanks are still going to leak. You're still going to have groundwater nearby, and you're getting some water into your tanks to figure out what's going to happen. So you really have to know your solubility and phase behavior. Consistency. So we're making most of the fuels from materials we dig out of the ground or we grow plants, and it's very inconsistent. So the stuff you find in nature is not pure anything. It's some mixture, and the mixture composition varies from place to place and time to time. But when you make the fuel, you want the finished fuel to always satisfy the specifications of the fuel that are important for the engine operation. And so this is tricky, is that you have to make your manufacturing process robust over the range of variation of your input materials. And the whole system for fuel distribution and processing and the vehicles, the whole system is going to work over some range of fuel parameters. But if your fuel gets outside that range, it's not going to work. And there'll be some failure. Who knows what the failure is going to be, but it's something bad, probably. And because the scale is so big, if you're running 80 million barrels a day, even a 1% problem is 800,000 barrels in one day. That's a really big problem. So if you have an off-spec batch of fuel, say you're running a refinery, it's maybe 30,000 barrels a day refinery, you run it for 8 hours, one shift, you have a problem. Say the operator in one shift doesn't know what he's doing. Okay? And so you make an off-spec batch. Well, that's a problem. Now I have 10,000 barrels of material that's off-spec. I can't sell to anybody. 10,000 barrels is a lot. I mean, it's like a whole gigantic tank farm completely full of this useless material. Not only is it useless, I had to buy the oil to make that stuff at $100 a barrel. So I have 10,000 times $100 worth of investment sitting there in some completely useless material. And if I have to dispose of it, I probably have to pay for waste disposal at something like $1 a gallon for waste disposal cost. It means I'm bankrupt, right? Just because of one screw up. So I need to really work on this. And I work with the MIT biodiesel student group. There's a student group that takes the waste vegetable oil and it converts it into biodiesel for the campus shuttle vans. But they've had massive problems because it's hard to get students to have this mindset that every batch has to be exactly perfect, right? Because I have one off-spec batch, what am I going to do with it? So you end up with this, we have this like tank like this size that will make the biodiesel, but if we make a bad batch, what are we going to do with it? It's like, who wants, I don't know, 100 gallons of useless, partially processed vegetable oil? It's like, with, and it's off-spec, so it has some, maybe some chemicals left over in it, or I don't know, some problem. And so there's a real quality control issue that's very important and very problematic for small producers especially. Big producers can pay to have a quality control staff and double monitoring and all kinds of stuff. The little producers like the volunteers at biodiesel at MIT, it's just not working. So anyway, this is a real practical issue. All right. Okay, environmental impacts. So all different kinds of environmental impacts that your fuel can have. One of them is volatility. So if the fuel is too volatile, when you try to fuel vehicles, some of the fuel always escapes and evaporates. And that evaporative emission, if you have a high volatility, can be a lot. And then that leads to smog, air pollution. And so that's the origin of the Reid vapor pressure spec on fuels. And it's why there's those gas tanks, so the funny snorkels to try to suck the vapors back in. And inside your gas, in your car, in the gas tank, there's a special sorbent that's absorbing the vapors. All kinds of tricky things to try to capture the vapors, because it's actually a very significant amount of source of air pollution. And so you have to be careful. If you design a fuel, you have to really be concerned about what your vapor pressure is. Some situations, some fuels can make a lot of particulates, either directly as soot, or they can form secondary aerosols. They emit something that reacts in the air and actually makes a particulate in the air. And those particulates are really nasty. So there's a lot of public health studies that show that on days when the particulate levels are high, a lot more people die. It's really direct death. And completely way outside the error bars. It's a very huge effect. Also, we have specs, for example, in aromatics and some soot specs that have to do with cancer, because those components are carcinogenic. So if you make your new fuel, you need to worry about whether the fuel itself is carcinogenic, and then also whether when it reacts, partially reacts in an engine, is it going to make something that's carcinogenic. And actually the largest source of waste material, carcinogenic waste material, toxic waste in the US economy anyway, is waste motor lubricating oil. Because the volumes of the liquids, the fuels and the lubricants in cars especially, are so gigantic, it's very easy for those things to become the dominant waste stream in the whole economy. At the present, emissions control is the most important constraint on engine designs and operation. And this leads to fuel specifications like the sulfur spec and specs of metals in the fuel. And those of you who work in diesel fuel will be very familiar with the ultra-low sulfur, ULSD, what was the D stand? Diesel, ultra-low sulfur diesel specification. And your new fuel, when you manufacture it, whatever you start with, is likely to have some impurities in it, and so you have to make sure that those impurities are low enough to satisfy all these things. And then biodegradability is a critical issue. There's a lot of components in fuels. Some of the components are very innocuous. Some of them are really bad. And you got to know when you make your fuel what you got. All right, fuels are really dangerous. So gasoline, for example, is 35 megajoules per liter. That's a lot of joules. And if you light it, you'll know it. And so have you ever seen those nice explosions in Hollywood movies? They're usually just a little tiny bit of gasoline, and you can make a really pretty impressive fireball. Also, the fuels are, most of them are toxic, mostly carcinogenic. A lot of the fumes affect the brain and nervous system. Basically, they're really bad. And so the safety issues are really very serious. There's a famous story about this low volatility and high volatility. If you make the volatility low enough, it's hard to ignite the fuel because you're at the lean limit. No. Yeah, the lean limit. You don't have enough fuel in the gas phase. So that's safe. So diesel fuel is designed to be like that. If you have a very high volatility fuel, then the tank will be flushed, all the air will get flushed out. So in a gasoline storage tank, the gasoline is so volatile, you make enough vapors, it actually pushes the air out of the tank. So at least the mixture inside the tank is not flammable because there's not enough air. You're at the rich limit. Of course, there'll be some distance outside the tank where it's mixed with the air, and there will be a place where you can light it on fire, which is why they have all those warning signs around a gas station about not letting any sparks nearby. But it's much safer that way. If you could actually have a combustible mixture inside the tank, if the flame would ever flash back into the tank, you could have a really serious problem. Knowing this is very important. This is actually the origin of Standard Oil, the Rockefeller Trust. The reason why it's called Standard was they were to reliably make fuels that had the right volatility cuts, so that they were like kerosenes, and they were low enough volatility that they wouldn't burn up, light fires in people's houses. And right before that, Standard Oil used the name Standard. There were a bunch of people selling kerosene, and a bunch of them were selling kerosene mixed with gasoline. And people had a lot of people burned to death in their houses trying to light their lamps. And so Standard advertised, ours is always safe. We always make it exactly the same way. And they did. And so they got basically 100% share of the whole world market on kerosene because everybody wanted to be safe. Safety really is important. And there's other fuels that are very dangerous. So some fuels form explosive peroxides in storage. In particular, some people consider using furans for biofuels. And some varieties of furans naturally polymerize to make a crystalline peroxide that one pressure sensitive, explosive. So it's really bad to have in your fuel tank. Some fuels burn with invisible flames, also kind of scary. Some fuels it's possible to make detonatable mixtures. This is actually relatively uncommon. And some fuels are skin soluble. The fuel will actually go directly through your skin barrier. And so that's usually very bad because it'll carry with it whatever is dissolved in the fuel. And if it's a carcinogen or whatever is being directly delivered into your bloodstream, it could be really bad. So these are all things you need to worry about. Fuel safety. Storage stability. Most of the fuels react with air. They make peroxides. They also make gums and phase separations. Some of the fuels will polymerize. And all these problems have led to the olefin specs on fuels. A lot of fuels are treated with additives to try to ameliorate these problems. But typically, this is still a problem. So if I buy gasoline, if I leave it in my garage for a couple of months, if I pour it in my lawnmower, the lawnmower won't work because I have so much gum that it'll clog the fuel injector. So fuels are still not really that stable. And then viscosity. And you just have to have a low enough viscosity. And problematic for some of the biomaterials, glycerol and sugars are both very, very viscous, and so they won't work with conventional fuel injectors. And so there's a bunch of specs that have to do with the fuel injection systems. And they're different for diesel and for gasoline. All right, so what have we done so far? We decided that we want to have some alternatives to petroleum to reduce the environmental impacts, increase the supply and security, and reduce the price. We've thought about a lot of different possibilities and the different properties. And what happens in practice is that most of the new fuels are diluted into gasoline or diesel. And that's very practical because the vehicles use those fuels and the infrastructure exists to distribute those fuels. But it has the problem that you can't sell your new material for anything more than the price of gasoline or diesel. But the production cost of all the new fuels are higher than the production cost of petroleum. So you're basically in a bad situation if you're manufacturing a new fuel because you're the high-cost supplier into a commodity market. And if you guys study economics, that's like the place you don't want to be. Because you're liable, if the demand shrinks or the production of your competitors rises, you'll be squeezed out. The price may drop below your production cost. And then your profit margin is really small, which means you won't be able to pay your investors back very fast. So that's a really bad situation. So let's see, is there any other option? And one option might be if you could actually introduce a third fuel at the gas station. All right, so here's the $64,000 question about this. The question is there any possible way that you could get a third fuel to succeed in the marketplace next to gasoline and diesel? Okay. Now, there's good reasons why this is hard to do. Because if you dilute whatever you put in petroleum, then basically it's mostly petroleum, and basically the fuel will act like petroleum. And so you're not going to screw it up. And it'll work fine in the existing engines. And you don't need any new distribution infrastructure. That's a huge advantage too. But if you had a third fuel, then you'd open up a whole kind of lots of possibilities. You could open up a lot of different possibilities for new engines that would not have to be stuck to using the same old fuels that we have now. You could insulate your new fuel from the oil price shocks. If the oil price collapsed, then your fuel might still have a market because there might be some vehicles that especially use your fuel. And maybe even your fuel could get a higher price than oil if you gave some special advantage to the customer that he decides is worthwhile. But you really have to provide a big advantage to make this work. And so this is a crucial question for anybody who wants to invent a new fuel that's going to not be diluted into gasoline or diesel, but actually replace them. So let's think of how this could work. So one possibility is you just make a fuel that's not soluble in gasoline or diesel. If it's not soluble in gasoline or diesel, then they're not going to dilute it into gasoline or diesel because they can't. Okay? So if you do that, there are some materials like this, like some polyols, some other polyoxygenates. Maybe you can make these from biomasses. But this is like a totally fruitcake option. No one has ever considered this as far as I know. You'd have to think, well, if I have some new fuel that's not soluble in the old fuels, what am I going to give the customer that's going to make him want to buy my fuel instead of buying gasoline or diesel? So that's a crucial question. The other possibility is you could take ordinary oil-soluble molecules, but there's something special about keeping them separate that makes it worthwhile for the gas station to keep them separate and worthwhile for the customer want to buy them specially. And there's two of them that I know of, are methanol and ethanol, because they have very unusual vaporization and rather low energy densities. And those properties make them really good for octane boosts if you do direct injection. So when you directly inject in a cylinder, you get a very big evaporative cooling. So the temperature of the cylinder drops a lot, which changes the ignition delay a lot. And so you're in a condition where your fuel would tend to ignite too fast. This is a way to really slow it down. And also you get a lot of charge cooling because you put in a fuel with a very high energy vaporization. And so you can get a lot more air crammed into the cylinder. So for high power output, fuels like methanol and ethanol can be really good. And then another idea is you could have some other kind of oil-soluble oxygenate. Then the question is, like, what advantage could you give to the customer from this new fuel or that would make it worthwhile to keep it separate? Why wouldn't they just dissolve it in? So I think most of the time these guys, they would just dissolve them into the petroleum right away. So these are the only two ones I've thought of that would make somebody want to keep them separate. So suppose you had one of those two and you wanted to keep it separate. How would you actually make it happen? So the key is you have to make everybody consent. So the vehicle makers have to make vehicles which want to take this new fuel. The fuel companies and the fuel distributors and the gas stations, they have to want to distribute this new fuel. They want to put an extra tank in their gas station. and they want to do it, so they have to make some money out of it. The political leaders probably have to encourage them, so they have to think it's something good in it for them, it's something good for the society. And the consumers have to want to buy it, so you have to give them something too. So the key is you have to get mutual consent by these 4 different players who usually don't cooperate on anything. And you have to make it last for many years, long enough for your fuel to really succeed in the marketplace and establish itself. And so you wonder what could possibly make this happen. And the only thing is everybody has to see that they benefit. And the only way that's possible is there really has to be a real advantage to this third fuel. If there's a real advantage to it, then somehow you can divide up the advantage and make everybody gain. But if there's no real advantage, there's nothing to divide up. And so nobody's going to make any benefit, and no one's going to want to do it. And the example we have in this country is E85. Have you guys ever been in Minnesota? Probably seen E85 in the gas tanks? So that's there because of government regulation and subsidy and kind of artificial, because E85 in the vehicles we have now gives really no advantage over gasoline. And also E85 is usually more expensive. So the consumer doesn't see any reason to pay for it. And the gas station guy only put the tank in because he was trying to please some political guy or he got some subsidy from somebody. But he doesn't care. And the car manufacturers, they get a credit from the government towards their CAFE standard for making flex fuel vehicles, so they make them. But they don't make them actually get any advantage out of using E85 because they don't care, because they're just doing it for the subsidy. And I think the gasoline companies probably think it's a stupid idea and don't want to get involved. So basically, it's been a flop. Now, I think E85 is actually a fuel that could succeed if people made vehicles that actually took advantage of the special properties of E85. But so far, the manufacturers of the cars haven't thought that there really was a big enough benefit to be gained to make it really worthwhile. So that's the key. And I think that dual fuel engines might be the way that this could happen. So Professor Haywood at MIT invented a dual fuel gasoline plus alcohol engine. And the way that worked was it ran on gasoline most of the time, but when you really asked for peak power out of the engine, it would also inject alcohol directly into the cylinder to get the charge cooling and octane number benefit. And that way they could use higher compression ratio on the engine all the time. So the fuel economy was higher. You didn't use that much alcohol because you only use it when you slam on the gas. And so the cost to the consumer was not much. And so the cost there is really the cost of just the car to be a little more complicated with the 2 fuels.
Is that a turbocharged car?
I think it's turbocharged and really small engine. Yeah. And I think Ford is pursuing this, but it has not commercialized it as far as I know. And then Professor Reitz, who was in the audience earlier today, he invented a dual fuel gasoline and diesel engine. And he takes advantage of the fact that you can shift how much gasoline and how much diesel you feed to try to keep the ignition delay of an HCCI type engine really optimal all the time. And so that's also very nice. So he demonstrated, under some cases, you get 53% thermal efficiency, which is pretty darn good for an internal combustion engine. And if you want to know more about that, don't ask me, ask Professor Reitz. But there's a small company trying to commercialize this one right now. Now this one doesn't actually use a new fuel, it just uses the 2 existing fuels simultaneously. But I think that this kind of concepts like this are ones that potentially might lead to a third fuel actually being useful. All right, so something's going to happen. The fuel production is plateaued, the fuel demand just keeps on increasing, the price of oil is going up, the current system is not environmentally responsible. It's dumping a lot of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Nobody has any energy security. But it's hard to predict what's going to happen to solve the problem. And it depends on a lot of policy decisions. And there's sort of a time that maybe we could add a third fuel at the pump, but who knows what it's going to be. Maybe it'll be electricity. Maybe the whole thing will be plug-in hybrids and there'll be fast recharge stations at the gas station. Who knows? And the key is, if the vehicle technology can actually take advantage of the third fuel in a way that the customer and everybody can see a real benefit, then I think there's a chance that this could actually happen right now because of the whole situation. All right, a quiz. So the military has been pursuing the option of using ammonia as the third fuel. And ammonia at H3. So I want you to try to list some of the concerns about this that we should check out before we decide we want to go with ammonia. What are the issues?
Deadly.
Sorry, what?
Deadly.
One concern environmental. So you think that it has nitrogen, so it should make NOx? That's a very big problem. Any other?
Toxic.
Toxic, that's right. Ammonia was used as a poison gas in World War I. Yeah. So probably will make it NOx. You need special catalysis to try to convert the NOx. Yeah.
Make explosive out of it.
Well, I guess you would put a lot of ammonia in circulation, which people could use to make explosives. I don't know actually right now. Maybe someone wants to make explosive, might be able to get ammonia anyway. But that's a concern. Sorry, what?
You burn it directly, you crack it.
You can do either way. Sorry? Ammonia is water soluble. That's right. So you have to be concerned that if you had tanks of it, you might get some into the water supply. I think it's not that dangerous in the water supply in low concentrations, but it smells. So people who drink the water probably complain. Corrosion, that's right. Bases are very corrosive to a lot of metals. So you'd have a lot of corrosion problems probably in the old tanks. You probably have a lot of leaks after you put the stuff in there. Yeah, so ammonia is produced on a big scale right now for fertilizer industry. And I think actually it's a pretty efficient process. So I think that, well, it'd be worth checking. But I think the environmental impact is not terrible. It's made from natural gas, so you definitely have CO2 emissions for sure. But then you don't get CO2 emissions when you burn it. So it'd be worthwhile to do a quantitative study to figure out how serious it is. In the back?
It's a gas at atmospheric conditions, so...
Can you shout? Or maybe the microphone, can you help us?
It's a gas at atmospheric conditions, so storage and transportation are going to be...
That's right. Pure ammonia is a gas, so it has all the disadvantages of a gaseous fuel. You need to use it under pressure, which actually makes the safety concerns more serious because if you have a leak, you have a lot of ammonia shooting out. And it's also the energy density is not that high, so it's a problem. Yeah?
That energy you gain, what energy does it take to produce ammonia versus what?
Right. I think it costs a little bit of energy to make, but it'd be worthwhile to check quantitatively. I think it's not a huge amount. I mean, it's...
Life cycle analysis of biofuels, making ammonia.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Why would you use ammonia instead of just using compressed natural gas, for example? They're both gases. Compressed natural gas certainly has a higher energy density than ammonia. Sorry?
Maybe they want to use a backup weapon.
I have no idea why the military wanted to do this. I doubt that that's it, though. It sounds like it'd be more dangerous for the soldiers nearby the tank. Yeah, Ben?
Maybe you want to investigate combustion properties, burning, velocity, communication behavior.
No, it's possible. Maybe it has very special properties because I think ammonia does, when it gets heated, releases hydrogen, which has a very high flame speed. So it may be a special situation where it would be very helpful. Go back there.
Would it compete with fertilizer and ultimately cause food prices to go up?
Yeah, so the second order economic effects, that's right. So right now the ammonia market is almost 100% for fertilizer. If you were to use it in transportation school, you'd have to have vastly huger scale of production than you have now. And so it would definitely affect the market. I don't know, but maybe I don't know, it'd be worthwhile to have some more study about that. More questions? All right, that's pretty good. You guys are good. All right. I think you're passing the quiz so far. All right, the last part, biofuels. So I'm going to talk about different parts of this, about the source of biofuels, which is biomass, and other competing uses of biomass. Then the current biofuels we use now, and then biological processing and thermochemical processing. All right, so historically, biomass has been the main energy source for humankind for thousands of years. And so this is like a very well-established, low-capital solar energy technology. You go out, you grow a tree, you chop it down, you bring it inside, put it in your fireplace, and you heat your house. Okay, that's very well-established. There's still maybe half the countries in the world that this is still a major fuel source for domestic uses, cooking and stuff like that. It's the most used renewable energy source of any energy source in the world. There's unfortunately many historical examples of biomass resource depletion due to overuse of this resource. And so I lived in England for a while, and you can really notice it, that in England, all the trees you see grow in rows, perfectly straight rows. And that's because they were all planted in the late 20th century. And before that, the entire island was basically deforested. People chopped down every single tree. So the whole place is just grass. And so then they replanted a few straight rows of trees. But you can see, you can definitely overdo it. I've never been to the Sahel, but I hear that it's maybe even worse than England as far as getting rid of all the trees. And unfortunately, the soil, there's not as much rainfall in the Sahel as there is in England, so the grass didn't grow back. Instead, it's just scrub and not much growing down there. And in Massachusetts, where I am from, used to have a very big industry based on whale oil. So that was a natural bio-oil they used to get by catching sperm whales. And they seem to have depleted that resource, and so we don't use sperm oil anymore. So it's definitely possible to overdo it. And this issue gets to be scale, right? So that there's many, many biomaterials that are available somewhere in some amount. But usually if you compare that amount to 80 million barrels per day, it's like no comparison. The scale is just wrong by many orders of magnitude. And also, biomass usually comes from the land. And when you start to think about the scale of biomass, you're fundamentally using a lot of land for some new purpose. But almost all the land in the world is already being used for something else. So you're changing the land use. And that has huge issues. It has issues for a greenhouse. So for example, if you're going to chop down the trees to plant farms, then all that just trees you chop down and release a lot of CO2 to the atmosphere. It has a lot of issues about food prices because land is a lot of it's used for agriculture. And just parks and all kinds of native environments. And there's like many, many reasons why you might not want to change the land use from the way you have it now, because you obviously chose to do the land use the way you are now for some reason. And so this is a big issue. But there are some possibilities. So there's a lot of waste actually from agriculture and from forestry. And so you could try to use that waste material more efficiently and maybe get some energy use out of that. And it's possible maybe you could grow special crops or algae on wastelands and actually take lands which are not really valued right now and make them into something more valuable. Now, the way biomass works is that fundamentally it's solar energy. And we're just using the plant to capture the solar energy for us. And this is the reaction. And the process is about 1% efficient. So you can capture about 1% of the energy that's in the photons ends up being captured in the biomass material. And the solar constant is pretty big. It's about 1 kilowatt per meter squared of energy is hitting the Earth. Now, a lot of the energy reflects in stuff like clouds or gets diffused. So this is a map of where the energy actually is. The red and white regions have pretty much solar energy. The purple and blue regions don't have much. But this number is pretty big, 1 kilowatt per meter squared. However, when you use photosynthesis, it's not very efficient. So you never achieve 3 megawatts per kilometer squared, which is not that much. So, just for example, my little town of 20,000 people needs a 15 megawatt electric generator. So we would need to be using all the biomass we could grow in a kilometer square, which would be maybe a quarter of the size of my town. Would have to be 100% devoted just to growing biocrops or something to grow out that much energy. The photosynthesis stores about 300 exajoules per year, which is a lot across the globe. So this is really a lot of energy. However, our energy use is even more, 400 exajoules per year. So we use more energy than the total photosynthesis of the Earth. And in fertile areas, this is the number, about 10 to the minus 5 exajoules per kilometer squared per year. A really important number in biomass is water. So it typically takes about 250 kilograms of water to make 1 kilogram of biomass. So you can see it very clearly if you go from a region that has a lot of rainfall to one that's drier. You can see the plants just really drop off fast. So if you drive west across Kansas, for example, if you're in the eastern edge of Kansas, it's one of the most fertile areas in the world. And if you get to the western edge, you can't barely grow nothing. And it's 100% just due to the rainfall is different across the state. Here's the total linear surface of the area of the Earth, if you want to figure that out. And also, growing biomass often requires fertilizers, especially nitrogen, actually ammonia, fixed from fossil fuels. So currently our agricultural system relies very heavily on fossil fuel inputs, and so it's not really CO2 neutral. And if you were to greatly increase the amount of agriculture, you'd also increase the amount of CO2 being released from fossil fuels. But if you have a lot of land and you have a lot of water, and then it's a relatively inexpensive way to get some energy, capture some energy, because basically you just throw some seeds out there, and there's a lot of rain, and you have to form nice soil, things will just grow, right? And you come back and you chop it all down, and you can burn it or whatever you want to get the energy back. And so it's a nice, inexpensive way to capture solar energy. It doesn't take much capital investment. You can contrast this to photovoltaics, which are about an order of magnitude more efficient at converting the solar energy into useful energy for us. But the capital cost is like several orders of magnitude higher than the capital cost of buying some seeds. So that's it. And then also, the energy security issue is mostly, there's no issue with biomass because almost all the countries that have high populations have very high amounts of arable land. That's why they have high populations. All right, so biomass typically has about 1.5 hydrogens per carbon, about 1 oxygen per carbon, and a bunch of impurities in it. It's usually very wet, about 50% water. It usually needs to be dried before you can ship it. It has a very low energy density, only about 9 megajoules per kilogram when it's wet. But you can pre-process it. For example, this process called torrefaction makes it something like charcoal, and then that would be a much higher energy density fuel if you want. The bad thing about biomass is it's produced everywhere, which means it's made everywhere. The stuff is everywhere, but it's all scattered all over the place. And the energy density itself, even when you pick it up, is very low. And so it's very expensive to harvest and ship per amount of joules you're shipping and harvesting. And also, it's usually all produced right at the end of the summer. And so you don't have it continuously. You have like peaks where you need a lot of capital equipment to harvest it, and then after that you don't have much happening. Also, you may need to store it to try to even out the peaks, but then storing the biomass is a problem. It's a low energy density. It rots. It attracts pests. There's all kinds of problems with storing the biomass. Here's chemically what it is. Biomass is mostly cellulose, which is a polymer of glucose. It also is a strange phenyl ether alkyl polymer called lignin, and then it has some fats and some proteins in it too. And there's another thing called hemicellulose, which looks like this with some 5-membered rings in there. Now, biomass is used a lot, and it's not just for energy. So we use it for energy to make heat, sometimes to make electricity, sometimes to make liquid fuels, but also to make food. Food is like the biggest use of biomass. Animal feed especially, actually. And it's also used for construction materials. It's used to make clothing. It's used to make paper. It's like used for a lot of stuff. And so if you think I'm going to take some biomass and use it to make gasoline, well, somebody else already has their eyes on that biomass. They were going to use it for something else. And so you have some substitution problems all across. Historically, the products from biomass, like food and lumber, were valued much higher than the energy value. And so the existing policies are mostly set up for this situation where they focus on agriculture and lumber and really have very little interest in the energy aspect of the biomass. So the whole system, and I think it's true in every country in the world, is basically set up with agriculture as the primary purpose of biomass and not thinking of it as an energy crop. So if you wanted to become a really material part of the energy picture, then you need to think of how to change all those policies and the common law and everything, the practices of how people manage land and so on. And then there were food price shocks and food riots a few years ago, and that's really raised people's awareness of the competing issues about how you should use arable land, what's the value of water, what's the good use of biomass for the society. And I think it's really unclear how much of these resources society should devote to energy versus food and all the other things that you want to use the land for. But despite all that, biomass is the largest source of renewable fuels now. So these are like the renewables, mostly hydroelectric power and biomass for fuel. And it's relatively simple to convert many components of biomass to liquid fuels, though not as simple as you think. I'll tell you more about that in a second. And so the governments have recently mandated that people have to use ethanol and biodiesel in a lot of products. And so because of the mandates, the amount of energy being produced as biofuels is really going up. Historically, wood has been the main energy source from biomass. So usually biomass, a lot of biomass is wood, people would use wood to make fires. That's like the traditional thing to do with biomass. And recently, people start to make it into liquid fuels. All right, so let's just do a little summary of where we are right now. Ethanol is actually really old. There's evidence of fermentation from 7,000 BC, which I think is pretty good engineering back then. By 800 AD, they were distilling alcohol. 1796, the first person made absolute pure ethanol, where they were able to get the water out all the way. Oil wasn't discovered until 1859. Invented the gasoline-powered car, 1885. 1908, when Ford was trying to think of what fuel to use for his new Model T, he said, well, ethanol would be great. So ethanol's been in the energy picture a long time. And the way it's made is by yeast. If you have oxygen around, then the biomass reacts to the oxygen. The yeast eats it up with oxygen and makes CO2. It makes lots and lots of energy. But if you deprive the yeast of oxygen, then they can still use this to make energy, but they only make 2 ATPs instead of 36. So the yeast would really prefer to react with oxygen, but if you're nasty and you suffocate the yeast by closing the lid, then the yeast will make do and just convert to biomass. Notice what happens when you take, say, a glucose molecule. You make 2 CO2s, so 2 of the carbon go away as CO2s, and 4 of them go into the ethanol. And we've taken a solid fuel that's not very high energy density and made it into a higher energy density liquid fuel. So this is like really beneficial from the liquid fuels point of view. And actually, this process is pretty darn efficient. There it is. All right. Now, this process is actually more complicated than what I just wrote. So you have to harvest the corn, transport the corn to your facility. Then you have to do some milling press steps. Then you have to do, you put some enzymes in to convert the cornstarch into sugars. Then you take the sugars and you ferment them with your yeast. Then you get the mixture, which is mostly water with a little bit of alcohol in it. And then you distill it, and then you get your ethanol. And then you can send it to your pump. And so this is actually pretty complicated. Problem is that cornstarch works pretty well to make ethanol, but it takes too much land. So we wanted to say, suppose we wanted to replace 1/3 of the gasoline that's used in the United States, and 1/3 of the transportation fuels. With using cornstarch, we'd have to use 320 million acres in corn. But the total amount of agricultural land in the whole United States is only 450 million. So we'd have to have like 75% of all the agricultural land in the United States planted in corn, and we'd still only replace 1/3 of the liquid transportation fuels we use. So this is really not a scalable solution for full scale. This is maybe a big niche application. At the present, we don't have this much land in corn. We only have replaced 5% instead of 33%, so about 1/6 the size, approximately the same size as Iowa. And we replaced 5% of the gasoline, and we have enough capacity in the United States to increase that a little bit. And so there's a big debate to go from E10 to E15. So they want to increase it a little bit. And then I think that'll about hit the limit of how much corn you can grow in the United States within current market conditions. There was a study, a very famous study called the billion-ton study. You might want to look it up. That tried to figure out, well, what else could we do? If we can't use cornstarch, we better use other parts of the plants. And they just counted up how much plant material there was in the United States. And they discovered that there was about 1 billion tons each year of waste biomass in the whole country. If you count all the waste material from every plant in the whole United States. And most of that is trees and corn stover, which is the rest of the corn plant. But there's also some straw from wheat and other grains. And then there's a bunch of little tiny ones. And so the corn stalks and the trees add up to each about 500 million tons each, which is quite a lot of material. And that altogether would be enough to replace about 1/3 of the liquid fuels. Now that's a discouraging number, I guess, as that means that we would need about 3 billion tons of biomass if we were actually going to replace all the liquid fuels just used by the United States, and about 12 billion tons to replace all the fuels in the whole world, which is way out of the range. But this kind of ratio, 1/3, or maybe more realistically 1/4 of all the liquid fuels could possibly be replaced by biomass, by waste biomass, without really affecting the ecosystem too much. Now, currently, we make corn ethanol using the process I showed you. And an interesting thing to do is try to figure out the energy balance. So when you grow the corn, you're absorbing solar energy. So that's sort of for free. And it makes a nice cornstarch. But actually, I had to give some fertilizer to the corn. So it cost me a bunch of fossil fuel to make the ammonia to make the fertilizer. And then I use a tractor to grow it. And so I need some diesel fuel for my tractor. And then I need a truck to carry the stuff from the farm to the plant. So I need some more diesel fuel for that. And then when I do the fermentation, I need to distill the mixture, separate the alcohol from the water. That takes a lot of energy. And you usually use natural gas for that. When I add up all that energy, it turns out that I use just as much fossil fuel energy to make the fuel as I get out of it. So this whole thing is actually not of any greenhouse gas benefit at all, or almost zero. So the corn ethanol thing has nothing to do with greenhouse gas. It's not harmful. What it really is converting natural gas energy into liquid fuel, sort of one for one. Now that works economically with a subsidy and because natural gas is cheap and liquid fuel is expensive. So it works okay economically, but it's really nothing to do with the environment. Now on the other hand, if you can make the ethanol from the whole plant, all the biomass, then the whole story is completely different. And then you would have a very big benefit because you would be using a lot of the fuel energy would actually be coming from solar energy, not from fossil fuels. And so that would actually have some greenhouse gas benefit. Unfortunately, despite a ton of work by a lot of people, nobody does this. And the calculation is the price of production of ethanol from biomass currently is about $120 per barrel, but the price of oil is only about $85 per barrel. So they can't get a lot of investors really excited about investing in these new plants. Yeah?
$120 is engineering expensive or finance?
I'll tell you more about the process in a minute. But there is a plant under construction in Italy for 1,000 barrels per day. So what we need, 80 million barrels per day. So we're 1/80,000th of the world demand will be satisfied by this plant. All right. Now the other conventional biofuel right now is biodiesel. It's a fatty acid, and we react it with methanol to make a methyl ester. Many of you in the CEFRC are studying this. And really, the fatty acids aren't free in the organism. They come in these forms of fats called triglycerides. So you have to do some reaction, and you make this glycerol as a side product. But this chemistry is pretty straightforward, and people know how to do this very well. And so there's lots and lots of plants around the world that make biodiesel. In fact, even MIT has a little room that does it. It makes off-spec biodiesel, but at least we make some. It's really a pretty good fuel. And biodiesel is used in trucks. It's used in heating oil. It really works fine. It works in jet fuel. They did some experiments that way. The problem is scale. So the best source of biodiesel right now is oil palm. It's a special palm tree that's been bred to have very high production of oil. And you can get 600 gallons per acre per year if you grow that in a very fertile area. In Europe, they use rapeseed, also called canola, and they get about 127 gallons per acre per year. In the US, people usually grow soybeans, and they get 48 gallons per acre per year. Now, if you think about that, you sell the fuel for maybe $2 a gallon. That means you only make 96 bucks for your whole acre of farmland in Iowa for a year. It's not going to pay your mortgage. And so this is just not economical. And it's because the production is too low. Even on the oil palm places, I think it only works because the labor charges are very low there, and the productivity is very high because the weather is so good and the soil is so good. So what could you do? Well, one idea that's really promising, I think, is that there's some bacteria and some yeast which can actually make these oils from glucose. So suppose you took cellulose, you took it apart to glucose, you fed the glucose to the bugs, they can make it into bio-oil. And that might be a very effective way to go forward. And there's a lot of people who would like to take the oxygen out of the biodiesel and make it into an alkane. And there's a lot of research underway on this for uses in jet fuel especially. All right, quiz. Suppose one of you guys is really brilliant and you invented a really inexpensive way that you just dump some wood in and out the back of your can comes beautiful liquid fuel. Write down what do you think would happen if that invention got widely disseminated. Water vapor. Probably some CO2. Yeah.
Deforestation.
Yeah, that's right. So it's my opinion too. I agree with you that I think that if this were to get widely disseminated, places that have a lot of forest and have a lot of poor people, it's a great way to make a living. You go out there and just chop the forest down and feed it into your machine and get this nice liquid fuel you can ship and sell in the world market at oil prices. So I think there would be a really strong pressure for deforestation that should happen. Yeah.
Demand will increase more than what it is right now because they can get, demand will increase more than what it is right now because they can get more cheaper oil.
That's right. So the world oil consumption might go up because the world oil price would go down because of this new production. This is definitely a possibility. Yeah, one more question, back?
CO2, because you might be interrupting balance. Because no, I'm sorry, I'll take that back.
I think it's not clear. It's possible, right? If the forests weren't managed nicely,
yeah,
then you chop down all the lot of trees really fast, and they all get burned up to make fuel. Fuel for vehicles. I don't know. It's possible CO2 might go up. It's not so clear, actually. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. It depends on how the forests are managed when they get chopped down. But if it was done in poor countries, probably they wouldn't be managed well, and so it might be really a problem.
Water reserve.
Yeah, that's right. So if you chop down the forest, especially places like the Amazon, you actually would affect the hydrology of the whole area. So I think, like I read that if the Amazon rainforest gets chopped down, Argentina may become a desert because it relies on the water vapor coming from the Amazon.
If the price is good enough, then it's too expensive. Why furniture?
That's right. That's right. Maybe the price of wood might go way up. That's right. Okay, so you get the idea. What we do is just think about that all these things, when you get to the scale that they're really material, they have all kinds of knock-on effects. And so you might think of what you want to accomplish as A, but actually maybe A is not really what you really want. Maybe you want B instead. All right? And so you try to think through what you're trying to accomplish. I know a lot of people are actually working on this, and they think it would be great, but I think that maybe they're not really thinking ahead far enough. Okay, second one. Do you think that this invention would solve the energy problem? Yeah?
No, you put on the slide that said that photosynthesis only supplies 3/4 of our demand or any. Presumably that's not all wood.
Right, exactly right. So this would be a great help for the energy problem, but for sure there's not enough wood in the world that you could that you'd be able to make enough fuel to last very many years for the fueling our vehicles, and then all the forests would be gone. All right. All right. That's right. So an interesting thing about something like this, suppose you made a technology that took any biomass and made it to a liquid fuel. And then you'd think, well, the smart thing to do would be to take wastelands, genetically engineer some plants to make them grow there, use that wasteland to grow the energy crop, run it in here and make liquid fuel. I think you'd have to figure out a policy regime to protect, say, the rainforest from all getting chopped down in the meantime while you're setting this up. So there's a very complicated regulatory policy issues all associated with this. And if you just release the technology without any thought, who knows what would happen, but I would guess it'd probably not be good, most likely. All right. Okay, now, but just because I just told you that this looks like Armageddon, that was a horrible disaster if we succeeded this, but let's go with it for a minute and figure out, let's see how we convert biomass into fuels. Now there's two ways to do this. One is biology and one is chemistry. And so let's first talk about biology. Conventionally, what people do with biomass is usually they burn it for heat. And in the paper industry in the United States, and probably most places in the world, they also use it to make electricity, to run the paper plants. But this is not really a scalable solution because coal is cheaper than wood. So you only do this when you happen to have some free wood. So for example, if you're a paper industry, you chop down the trees anyway, you have the branches, you might as well use it. There's an option here where you can take the biomass and mix it up with coal, and that would reduce the CO2 impact of the coal. And so that's talked about a lot. I would say that that's mostly a way to evade the carbon cap and not really a real solution, is my opinion. But we can talk about that. Another idea is you could gasify biomass, and there's a lot of technology that does that just fine. But I think this makes no sense because natural gas is pretty cheap anyway, and it's hard to, economically how you would ever make this work. It's only really if it was very heavily subsidized or with some regulation that prohibited people from using natural gas. So I think the most likely thing that biomass would be used for is to make liquid fuels. And that would definitely be the most profitable thing because liquid fuels are so expensive. And there aren't that many good competing alternatives, so biomass has the best chance to be successful in that market. So remember, we started with biomass as a solid, which is totally useless, as we talked about useless fuels. And it has a very low energy density, or pretty low. It's wet. And it has lots of oxygen in it, more than we like. And it's basically not compatible with the engines. Even if you could make it into a liquid, if it was the same composition, the same chemical composition, it wouldn't work in the fuel injectors and so on. And so you really have to convert it to something else if you're going to make it work with the existing energy infrastructure. So you want to take those molecules I have in the top and you want to make them in these nice simple alkene type things at the bottom. So you have two choices. You can do it biologically. Usually people do this with microbes, which they use to convert biomass to fuels. You could also do it by actually growing plants like oil palm, or you can genetically engineer plants to make stuff you want. Also some algae directly make stuff you want. And the pros with the biological approach is you have the possibility of engineering real specificity. So you can make a biological system make exactly the chemical you want. In fact, all the chiral centers in the molecule will be exactly what you would specify. It's incredible, actually. The plants and the microbes are the best chemists in the world. They can just exactly make whatever you want. The downside is that they also want to be fed exactly with what they want. And if you feed the bugs the wrong thing, they get sick and die. And so you need to, you're very constrained in what you can do with a biological system. Also, the biological systems have relatively low throughput. So it's usually processing times of days, which translates into very large volumes of reactors. So if you're going to make 1 million barrels per day, you need really huge fermentation ponds to make that much material. And then you typically have separation issues. The biomass itself is a horrible mixture. And then when you run the fermentation to make something, you make another horrible mixture. And so you have two difficult separation steps. And often the separations are most of the capital cost of the process. But there's examples of people doing this. And so ethanol, methane, and butanol are all manufactured at reasonably large scales in this way. Now, the alternative is thermochemical processing. And we take typical chemical processing used in the refining industry, and we convert it to bioproblems. And one advantage is that the processing industry handles oil, tar, coal, horrible stuff, horrible mixtures of all kinds of horrible stuff, and it's robust. That technology works for very complicated mixtures, and also has pretty high throughput. So you'll have reactor times of like seconds or minutes, as opposed to days for a bioreactor, which means the reactors can be much smaller. You have much higher intensity of the process, much smaller plants, so you can process more material. The cons are that in order to achieve the very high productivity, high throughputs, usually you have to use very high temperatures and often very high pressures because a lot of the processes are gas phase. And so that makes the equipment more expensive. So it's smaller, but there's some trade-off here that your reactors are actually more expensive because you have to make them able to handle the temperature and pressure. And you usually have to add catalysts, which costs some money. And the biosystems, a lot of times they'll foul the catalysts. And that gets to be a very serious problem because every time it fouls a catalyst, you have to take all the catalyst out, put new catalyst in, it costs you money, and also it costs you time to clean the catalyst, and it shuts down the unit for a while, and so that costs you money too, capital cost. And then the product you're going to make from thermochemical processing is going to be a mixture. So you put mixture in, mixture out. And if that mixture happens to be what you want for your fuel, then that's great. But you don't have that much control, and it might not be exactly what you want. And then if you wanted to separate it then, it might be difficult to make the separation. And there's a lot of examples of this. So biodiesel is done by thermochemical processing. Syngas can be produced by gasifying biomass. You can do pyrolysis bio-oil, which I'll explain in a second. Now, a simple idea is, well, let's forget the whole chemical plant. Let's just use the plant. So let's grow plants that make the fuel we want, and we just go along and we pick them. We pick our fruit, and instead of being something I eat, I just squeeze it into my gas tank, and then I'm good, right? Good to go. And palm oil is the best example we have of that. We have a plant that grows a material which is pretty darn close to diesel fuel, and only takes a very small amount of processing to make it into diesel fuel. And I don't know the history of palm oil myself, but I assume that plant breeders over many years kept picking the palm oils that made the most oil, and they kept hybridizing them and breeding them to try to make the palm oil have higher and higher productivity, and that's why it's so high. And you could probably bioengineer it even better to make even more oil. And you could probably go back to other plants and do the same kind of thing, try to make them produce more of whatever you wanted as your fuel. There's also a lot of interest in algae, which make oils. So there's some natural algae which photosynthesize sunlight to actually make oils directly. They have even higher productivity than the palm oil. And they also can grow in salt water instead of fresh water. So you don't have to use them in a place where you would grow normal crops. You can grow them in a brine pond, for example. The problem with algae is they're very, very diluted in water. So you end up with an even more difficult separation problem than usual. That you end up with a little tiny bit of oil in a huge amount of water, and how are you going to get it out? And also, the problem with all these genetically engineered strains and stuff is that the natural ecosystem is not one pure strain. It's usually like a gazillion different microbes all living together. And if you have any opening to the environment, whatever strain you're trying to grow, by Murphy's Law, will immediately be killed by some invading species, and it'll wipe them out. And so people have tried to do algae experiments out in ponds, and almost immediately the algae strain will die, and they'll be replaced by some other strain which doesn't make the oil you want. And so you may have to do this in closed reactors all the time, which makes the cost a lot higher. Now, it's also possible to engineer plants in many clever ways. And so, for example, I know one company that's bioengineered plants so that the lignin will spontaneously break when the plant dies, and it'll let the cellulose out. And that makes it a lot easier to harvest the cellulose. So there's a lot of crafty things that the bioengineers, with their great creativity, can think of to try to make plants that will make it easier for people to do different steps in the processing. And maybe you guys can think of some more clever ideas from that. But I would say, overall, most researchers in this field said, forget it. This is too hard. Plants are too hard. Agriculture is too hard. Let's just use the waste agricultural material we have already. Let's not get into it. And so this is like oddball, small percentage of people working in this area. Most people are instead saying, let's assume we've got regular biomass. It's made of what's called lignocellulose, which is cellulose, hemicellulose, and it's wrapped in lignin. Lignin is like the impermeable waterproof wrapper that's holding together the cellulose, which is most of the strength of the wood, the cell wall. And there's some hemicellulose there too. I don't know what that's for. And the cellulose is really what you want. It's about 40% of the weight of the plant. And if you can take it apart, it goes right to glucose. Glucose is all-purpose feed for all microbes. And so once you get to that point, then you're golden. The problem is nothing eats lignin. There's almost no organisms that can eat lignin. Lignin is the plant's material to protect itself from other organisms. And so you have a problem. You really have to get rid of the lignin. And actually, there's not that many thermochemical processes that work to get rid of lignin either. So lignin's a big problem. And then the hemicellulose is pretty easy to take apart, but most organisms can't eat the 5-ring sugars, and some of them are poisoned by them. So there's a whole issue about how do you persuade the microbes to eat the 5-ring sugars as well? Otherwise, the whole fermentation broth just gets full of 5-ring sugars after a while. And then the high concentrations of the sugars can actually kill the microbes. All right, so here's the process. Typically, they would take some corn stover, that's the stalks, and then they would treat it with some heat and acid to try to get the lignin off of the cellulose. Then they would have to do something to detoxify it because the acid would kill the microbes. Then they add some enzyme, actually a couple enzymes. One of them is cellulase, which unzips the cellulose into glucose. They also add some other enzymes, which helps to keep on ripping the lignin off of the cellulose. Then they take the glucose that was secreted by taking apart some of the cellulose, and they put that into the fermentation broth. If they're good, they've specially treated the yeast so it can also eat the 5-ring sugars as well. And then you get stuff which is basically beer that comes out of there. It's a dilute solution of alcohol with some plant products in it. And then they have to purify the ethanol, and that's how you get your ethanol fuel. Now, when you try to figure out the energy balance, it's totally different. We don't have to add as much agricultural inputs because we're basically getting this for free as a waste material. The lignin basically has no value, but we can burn some of it to get some of the heat we need for the separations. And in regular corn ethanol, there's a cornstarch byproduct called DDGS, which is an animal feed. You don't get that from the stalks. So that turns out to be economically hugely important because the animal feed actually sells for more than the fuel does. And so the economics are screwed up by the fact that you don't have that. And that really hurts the cellulosis process a lot, economically. Now, another option, instead of trying to take apart the biomass to make sugars, is you could just gasify the whole biomass in a gasifier, and that would make syngas, hydrogen and CO. And then there's some special microbes which can actually eat carbon monoxide. And they'll eat the carbon monoxide and make ethanol. And so this is like an alternative approach. It avoids the acid treatment and the cellulase and a lot of the problems earlier on. Of course, you substitute all the problems with gasifiers with biomass, which are that the gasifiers tend to get plugged by tars, and you have to do some special stuff to make sure the gasifiers are good. But this is definitely a possibility as well. Now, the general idea is we're going to take some feedstock, feed it to our bugs, which we call our conversion technology. It's going to be some metabolism of some bug, and it's going to secrete our fuel that we want. That's the general concept. And we want to change the bugs. The bugs naturally don't want to make fuel. They don't work for Exxon. They just want to grow and be peaceful bugs and do their own bug thing. And they're not really trying to make fuel. And we want to change that. So what we want to change is we want to change the enzymes inside the microorganism and regulate the enzymes so that it goes to the product we want and doesn't do all this other stuff that the microbe would normally do. So we'll go and we'll get rid of some enzymes that run the pathways we don't like and lock off this way, and then we'll add and increase the production of this certain enzyme that runs the first step, and so then we can force the thing to run through to the product we want in a higher yield. So this is called metabolic engineering. If you understand how the microbe works very well, you can figure out which enzymes to block, which ones to promote, and then you can drive the microorganism to make more of the stuff you want. You can also add enzymes which don't even exist in that organism. So you can do genetic engineering, bring in strange enzymes from the outside other organisms, put them inside this organism, and make them introduce new pathways. And so, for example, if I wanted to make product P prime, I could actually add an enzyme that converts B to D, and another one that makes D to B prime, and then P prime will come out. And then I might want to shut off this channel, for example, get rid of E3, and then I can just force it to go this way. And so the metabolic engineers, they know all about this stuff. It's super complicated. The way I wrote it here is really simple. In reality, each of these enzymes has a control loop. So there's another molecule that promotes it, another one that deactivates it, and there's usually some complicated control structure that's sensing production of P, and it's using that to downregulate E10 and upregulate E11 or something like that. And so I need to do something with those control loops as well. But the metabolic engineers have figured this out for a lot of, especially for E. coli, also for yeast. And so then they can actually make this work. So here's some examples. They took the yeast and they made it ferment 5-ring sugar. Xylose is a 5-ring sugar, and to make it into ethanol. And they did this by a heterologous route, which I think means that they added an enzyme that doesn't exist in regular yeast to make this happen, but it actually works. You can read about it in that paper, 2007. You can take glycerol, which is a byproduct from producing biodiesel, and then they can genetically engineer E. coli to convert glycerol into ethanol. And so that was done in 2008. You can add entire whole pathways that don't exist in the organism. So this is adding 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 new enzymes and their control structures and a bunch of other stuff to E. coli. And now E. coli suddenly makes butanol, where it never did before. And it took these from some other organism that makes butanol, but the other organism doesn't grow as fast as E. coli, so it wasn't as desirable. So this one, they get E. coli grows really fast, and then it also can now make butanol as well. So you can do all kinds of fun games with genetic engineering to try to make it more. And because of all the different diversity of ideas about what to do, there's a ton of little companies that do this. And so here's some of them. And there's like dozens and dozens. And I don't want to endorse any of them. I have no idea which of these guys are actually going to be successful. I'm not an investment advisor. I don't recommend you're buying stock in anybody. But if you want to, go ahead. And they're kind of cool. So if you wanted to own stock in a cool company, they have a lot of cool ideas. And they're trying to figure out how to make this actually work. So to summarize, there's tons of different biological routes. And you can engineer the plant, or you can engineer the algae. But most researchers have decided just to go with waste biomass and just convert it. The processes are slow, but the equipment is not that expensive, so maybe it works out okay. The bugs mostly require pure sugars, and all of them require harvesting and transporting the biomass. So you have a lot of upfront costs, which you're stuck with, which is a lot, and actually sets a floor in the price. So you really need the oil price to be high, the fuel price to be high, otherwise you're going to be in trouble. You can engineer the bugs to make specific fuel molecules you want with tremendous specificity. It's incredible. So if you knew what you wanted, you'd be really good. The problem is with this audience and with me, most of the time I don't know what fuel I really want. So I don't know what to tell the bioengineers. They say, well, what should I make my bug make? They say, here's 47 different molecules I know how to make. Which one is a great fuel? And I was like, well, we've never had any of them. I never put any of these in any engine. How do I know which one is good? And so that's actually a big part of the CEFRC is trying to figure out, can we predict which proposed molecules are actually worthwhile to make as fuels? A big problem in bioprocessing is separations. So most fermentations only make grams per liter of the product you want. That's 0.1%. And then you have to purify it up to pure stuff. So you have to get rid of a tremendous amount of water in the fermentation broth. And that's often a really difficult problem. The best material is ethanol, which has been genetically engineered over the years by brewers to make it up to 12%, which is pretty good. But even 12% is so hard to separate out of something. So there's a lot of water you're processing. And that's usually a very significant cost. And maybe what you want is genetically engineer a fuel molecule which just separates from water spontaneously. That might be the thing to do. And in fact, a couple of the companies have ideas like that. And then the other option is if you could think of some special fuel advantage that would make your molecule really valuable so people would pay a lot of money for it, that might make your process really go. So you have that option. If you can think of what would be really great as a fuel, so the customer would really want to buy it, then maybe you can get them to pay enough that would make it worthwhile to do this expensive separation process. Okay, I know you're getting tired, but this is the last one. Hang in there. Chemical conversion of vitamins. All right, so you have a lot of choices of what to do. And there's two main, a big branch point is, can I operate on the full biomass, or do I have to do all that pre-separation stuff to try to get the cellulose out, the sugars? And there's chemical processes based on both routes. So one group of chemical processes are based on whole biomass. And the most popular one at the moment, I think, is called fast pyrolysis, where you just very quickly heat a bunch of biomass really high temperature, and it unzips to make a lot of lower molecular weight stuff that could be good fuels. And the other possibility is you could actually make sugars first and then do a lot of sugar chemistry to convert them into the fuels you want. And the first process, the problem with it, the whole biomass, is you always have crud. The biomass has a lot of different metals in it, has all kinds of stuff in it. And so if you have any catalyst or anything that's sensitive in the whole reactor, guaranteed it's going to get plugged up and fouled by the by the other materials. You have molten salts in there, you have all kinds of crap. And so you have to make your reactor very robust if you want to do the direct process. On the other hand, if you use pure sugars as your feed, then you really have a lot more control, and you can try to do some more specific chemistry. But the disadvantage is you have to pay for the cost of making the sugar, which is a lot, because you have to do all the pre-processing I told you about. Okay, so the idea of the fast pyrolysis and also the hydrothermal liquefaction is basically to cook the biomass. So biomass is a polymer. When you increase the temperature, entropy is in your favor to unzip the polymer and make monomers. So all the polymers will unzip when they're hot enough. So you heat it really hot, the polymers unzip, and they make a bunch of small molecules. So that's great. And some of those molecules will be liquids in the right range to be fuels. Some of those molecules will unzip too far and they'll become gases, which is, you might be able to use a little bit, but not really what you wanted. And sometimes when you unzip it, you partially unzip two things, and then they recombine, and they make something that's intractable, and that becomes a char. And you usually see some char or tar forming in these processes as well as the liquids you wanted. There's two ways to do it. One is to take sort of gas phase process. You just blast the biomass into a furnace with no air present, and the biomass spontaneously breaks up into a bunch of smaller molecules. Because the temperature is so high, they all evaporate, and they carry them out as gases, and then you can condense them. And that stuff, when you condense, is called bio-oil. The problem with bio-oil is it's full of acid. You make a lot of carboxylic acids from this process, and it's so acid that it'll corrode a lot of materials, and also it catalyzes polymerization reactions. So you depolymerized the stuff at high temperature, cool it down, the equilibrium's shifted, so now that equilibrium would favor to repolymerize. And because you have the acid present as a catalyst, you actually repolymerize it. So you've like totally undone your good work of unzipping it, because it's all back up again. Unfortunately, it zips up randomly because it's acid catalyzed, not enzyme catalyzed. So in the plant, it was enzyme catalyzed and made beautiful cellulose, all exactly the same. When you randomly put a whole bunch of strong acid on a bunch of biological monomers with a lot of active sites, you just get a horrible mess. And you just get basically it's like syrup, and black and smelly, and nobody knows what to do with it. So that's a real problem. The other options you can do what's called hydrothermal liquefaction, where you actually keep the stuff wet, and then you raise the pressure and raise the temperature. And the whole thing gets to be sort of like supercritical water. You don't let the water boil, but you raise the temperature so high that you can do cooking reactions even though in the presence of the water. And that tends to reduce the some of the side reactions because the water is like a diluent keeping the molecules apart. And also, in the first process, you're evaporating all the water that was in the biomass to begin with. In the second process, you have to keep the pressure, so you never let it go gas phase. That way, it doesn't absorb the energy. So it makes the energy efficiency better. The disadvantage is you need a high-pressure reactor, which makes the reactor much more expensive. All right, so there's fast pyrolysis, and that's the way it usually works. And because of this problem that the product is not stable, because it's going to polymerize and corrosive, usually people have to do is immediately hydrogenate it using hydrogen they make from natural gas. And that's the most common idea. But this is a pain in the neck because that's also a high-pressure process, and it adds to the expense of the process a lot. And also, you might think of doing this at a farm, but it's unlikely the farmer's going to have a hydrogenator there. So this is a practical problem. You may have to ship it all to a central facility, which adds to transportation cost. This is the hydrothermal process, and you avoid the enthalpy of vaporization, so you improve your energy efficiency. And you can, because it's all liquid all the time, you can do liquid-liquid heat exchangers, and you can actually very good heat recuperation. So the energy efficiency is pretty good. But this is a very high pressure, often a couple hundred bar, above 100 bar. And also, high-pressure water is very corrosive itself, so you need to use special metals to make these reactors. And so you have a lot of problems. Also, the biomass usually has sodium chloride, a salt in it. Chlorides in hot water, high pressure, are very corrosive, and so you have a lot of metal problems, metallurgy, leaks, and stuff like that. But it's kind of cool. So here's, you put a chunk of wood in water, and then you just heat it up under high pressure at 340 C. You just see the different amounts of time. This is like after minutes. the wood particles just like disappearing. Oh, wood's all gone. So the wood just goes away. It just unzips. So that polymer is gone. It's kind of cool. But the process conditions are kind of tough. 330C, 100 bar. All right, and you make different products depending on exactly how you do the cooking. If you do a hydrothermal, you make one set. If you do a fast pyrolysis, you do a different set. Actually, if you change these conditions, you make slightly different mixtures. All of them have pretty much oxygen left in the product, so you have a problem with too much oxygen in the fuel. So then you have to do hydro deoxygenation. And most common idea is to add a lot of hydrogen to it, and you can do it using a certain amount of hydrogen. This is actually a lot of hydrogen, and so you're really you're adding hydrogen from an external source. You need other energy to make the hydrogen, and then usually fossil fuel. So you're losing a lot of the greenhouse benefit, but you're souping up your liquid fuel by adding all this hydrogen. You're actually adding energy to it, increasing its heat of combustion, and so you can really stretch your biomass. If you have a certain amount of biomass, has a certain amount of energy, if you can add hydrogen and get rid of all of the oxygen by hydrogen as water, keep all the carbon, then you get more fuel net. And so if biomass is very expensive, this is a way to go, but it loses in the environmental departments. I should just remember, you'll see a lot of papers that say, oh, just use a renewable H2 source. But we don't have a renewable H2 source. If we did, our whole problem would be a lot different. So yeah, I think that's a bogus argument. So right now, you need a lot of energy to make the hydrogen. But this might still be a good idea, because hydrocarbon fuels are really pretty nice. Here's a cool plant. They actually had a factory. They made it next door to the Butterball turkey plant. They got all the bits of the turkey that the Butterball didn't want to sell to anybody. And they chopped it up in a maceration plant. And then they heated it to 250 degrees C in water. And that took the fatty acids off. Then they heated it all the way up to 500 degrees C. This is pretty darn hot. It's at 800 Kelvin in really high pressure water. And that cracks everything to smithereens. And you get a whole bunch of diesel and gasoline out of that. And there's the products. You get some char. You get some minerals, like all the salts and stuff that were in the turkey. You get some gasoline. You get some diesel. And then you have, this is what the black gunk looked like before you cooked it the rest of the way. It was just like bio-crude. It was a horrible black mess. But if you cook it all the way up, you take it. So this actually worked. This was a plant. It was doing great. Well, not that great. They went bankrupt in 2009. So some investors lost a ton of money on this plant. But it worked. The technology worked. The economics didn't work. And this is a real problem in this whole biofuels area. Is there's a lot of clever ideas, but man, it's tough to make it really economical. There's a ton of great work by guys like Dumesic, Lenny Schmidt, Huber. These guys all working on different ways to take different molecules you get from treating the biomass and converting them into different possible fuel molecules. And there's a ton. This is very brief. There's actually tons and tons of papers in this. And this is a very hot thing to try to figure out all the different things you can make. And some of them you can sell as chemicals, and some might be good fuels. Yeah. Why did they go bankrupt? So when you're a professor and you have this great idea, and you go to a venture capitalist and you say, hey man, give me $20 million, I'm going to build this factory for this cool idea. And I tell him how cool it is, and I think it's really cool. That's why we went to it. And he thinks it's cool too. So he says, cool, this could be the future of energy. So he gives me $20 million, and I build a factory, and I hire a whole bunch of guys to work there, and managers and business guys and everything. And if all those guys do their job perfectly, and if my idea is really great, then the venture capitalist is going to make a lot of money. But there's a chance my idea is not that great. There's a chance that all those guys don't do their jobs perfectly. There's a chance it's unforeseen situations. Maybe Butterball decides to close their factory right next door to my plant, and so now I have to ship my turkey parts from far away, and the shipping costs makes it impossible. Right? Who knows? There's like so many things could happen in the business world. I did the calculations at the time when oil was $100 a barrel, and then by the time my plant starts, it's $85 a barrel, and I can't afford the 15 bucks. Right? Who knows? There's a lot of things. So you know, in the business world, 90% of startup companies fail. But the venture capitalists keep betting in them, and that's because if the ones that hit, maybe 2% of the ones that hit really hit and might pay back 100 times what you invest. So, you know, it's like totally risky, but you know, that's life. I don't know. It's the entrepreneurial system. So you just try your thing. You try to think as hard as you can. Every possible thing can go wrong. But of course, when you actually build a plant, you know, this pipe over here clogs, you never thought could possibly clog. And you don't know what the heck's causing that, right? The feathers from the turkey get into somewhere. I mean, who knows, right? So, you know, I think they had a problem here, actually, that some of the proteins from the turkey react with some of the sugars, and they make something that's like a higher viscosity that played it out somewhere. So they never anticipate that, right? It's like, you know, how do you know until you actually do it? So they try to do little test tube things as best you can, but you only have a little NSF grant. You can only afford one student for half a year, and then you're broke. So, you know, you really don't know until you try whether it's really going to work. There's a lot of people working on conventional methods that using conventional chemistry to get rid of oxygen. And this is very big for biodiesel. So, for example, UOP has a process. They can take vegetable oil, and they can just process it basically to jet fuel that's indistinguishable from jet fuel by just hydrogenating like crazy until it's just all alcohol. And so that process definitely works. It uses a lot of hydrogen, so this is definitely not a greenhouse gas solution. But if your customer is willing to pay a lot for the fact that it came from vegetable oil, like for energy security point of view, maybe this is all right, to summarize. The chemical conversions in general, they run at high temperature and pressure, and so they use much smaller reactors to get higher throughput. It's more like a refinery, so it's really a kind of a chemical engineer's thing. The high P reactors are expensive, and so the hydrothermal process has a lot of potential problems just because of the pressure. This is also a problem for gasifiers too. The chemical routes really reduce the need for the biomass pretreatment, which saves you a lot of money in separations, and also the products usually are simpler to separate too. But you have a lot less specificity, and so it's almost like you're at the mercy of what the biomass is. You run the biomass with your process, you'll get something. You have very few knobs to turn to try to change what that something is. If something turns out to be great, you know, high-octane gasoline I can sell for a lot of money, that's great. If it turns out to be some cruddy stuff that I have to use as fuel oil, that's the way it is, the way life is. There's quite a few chemical conversion routes that also seem to be viable, but as far as I know, none of them are really economical. So here's some main points. It's definitely practical to make some biofuel that you would dilute into petroleum fuels, but you have to be aware then of the oil price, because the oil price fluctuations could kill you off. If you want to make a third fuel to be independent of the oil price, you need to demonstrate that it has a really big performance advantage, that somebody's willing to pay for it. But if you could do that, you might be able to avoid that problem. The main problem with biomass is it has too much oxygen in it, and you have to remove it. Usually it's CO2 and water vapor. If you have hydrogen available, then usually it's preferable to remove it as water vapor and keep the carbon, because the carbon adds to the size of your liquid fuel, which you can sell. And so you make more money because liquid fuels are so expensive. For efficiency, separations are the problem, and especially water. The biomass is wet, the fermentation makes it wetter, and you have all this water separation to do, which is a big problem. So if you can think of clever tricks to avoid or simplify separations, it really helps you. And maybe you could make water insoluble fuels that would self-separate. That might be a huge advantage. There's enough waste biomass in the world to supply about 25% of the liquid fuels, but it's expensive to collect and transport, so it's not really a practical number to reach. And then there's an issue: is how much effort should you put into 25%? And I think that's a debate. You know, it's like it's not going to solve the whole problem. But then again, 25% of 80 million barrels is still a heck of a lot of barrels. So, and there's a ton of unresolved problems about the economics, the land use, the policy, and also about the technology. So this is like a wide open area. You have a clever idea, maybe you'll have the one that really works. So I think that's all I got. So thank you very much.